This is unSILOed, brought to you by Alumni FM, connecting people through stories.
Welcome to unSILOed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with Lincoln Perry, who is a painter, sculptor, muralist, and author of most recently of this book called Seeing Like an Artist: What Artists Perceive in the Art of Others. Welcome, Lincoln.
Thank you.
So in this book, I think one of the main messages of the book is that as a practicing artist, you benefit from consuming the work of others, right? And you can become a better artist the more time you spend, right, looking at the work of other artists. But also the corollary to that is that you become sort of a better appreciator and consumer of art if you are a practicing artist, or at least you spend some time practicing. But it seems like, these activities are frequently kept separate, right? Not only in the academy, where we have different departments, right, for the practice of art and the study of the history of art, but also, I think most people who go to museums and kind of look at the work in museums, they haven't spent any time trying to make art, and maybe this impedes their capacity to really appreciate it. So, why is it that we, I guess, keep these things separate? Should artists spend more time in museums, and should people who go to museums, right, spend some time learning how to paint at least in some very basic way?
I think it's a waste if people don't. I have a friend who's a wonderful art historian, quite well known, and he's also a wonderful painter. And it seems to me that those two disciplines don't have to be separated, shouldn't be separated the way they are. It doesn't mean that people should bone up on every art history book in sight before they go to a museum. In other words, I think that the work speaks for itself. And over time, the more time you get to spend with this art, the more motivated you are to research what interests you. So say you go to a very large museum like the Louvre, and you go to that huge hall that has the Géricaults and the Delacroix, and they knock you out, which they should. You could then read about the story of the Raft of the Medusa, which has been written about by any number of people eloquently. Julian Barnes wrote about it. And basically, the story, for me, is secondary. In other words, you are motivated to read the story having been bowled over by the painting. In fact, one of my heroes was a relative, now obviously very obscure art historian, the art critic, who also painted, by the way, named Roger de Pile, who in 1685 told the French Academy that, in his opinion, they were getting it backwards. They were reading paintings as if they were texts. Mm-hmm. And he said it was more like music. Paintings are more like music. They should wash over you. And if they pull you in and seduce you, you're motivated to read them at that point, to figure out their content, their narrative, who's who, the iconography. But if you start with that, it's usually fairly intimidating and off-putting somehow to think that it's a quiz and that who is this character? Well, it's Flora. In the, say, a painting that everybody knows, Primavera by Botticelli. Yeah, it's Flora. And that might occur to you over time. But the thing that occurs to you first is you've gotten to Florence with great difficulty. You've gotten into the Uffizi with great difficulty. And you found space in front of Primavera with great difficulty. And you stand there, and over time, it's a huge painting. Over time, you might say, I wonder who that character in the upper right is blowing on a woman with flowers coming out of her mouth. We don't know these things. We're not versed in myth the way the Renaissance aristocracy would have been. So it takes some study, but it's only tertiary, secondary or tertiary, it seems to me, in terms of appreciating a painting as music, as something sensual, as something that only becomes intellectual over time. I think I won't go into the modern art world, but I think we've front-loaded it in the direction of intellectual. Roger de Pile speaks to us now in the same way he spoke to the Academy back then.
So, there's two ways that you can approach a work of art as an educated consumer. One is to understand the iconography, right? And to understand the history and the context. And then another is to understand the methods of composition and
Right.
technique and so forth. And I think one of the points that you were making is that, with art historians, they struggle with this, right? And sometimes they overemphasize the formal aspects of a work of art, and maybe other times they overemphasize the historical and the iconographic. I mean, I guess having a little bit of both is always a good thing, but I mean, is it important to strike a balance there? I mean, to cultivate both aspects of artistic
I think it is, but I think it depends on the kind of painting as well. I mean, in other words, people were first flummoxed by abstract art because they couldn't see a story and they didn't know how to make sense of this painting. Their formal structure, which is what we try to learn in school and what this book sort of addresses, it's not formalism per se, which got a very bad reputation by being over formalized, but it is looking at structure. In other words, if you're a composer and you're studying how to write music, it helps, for instance, to read music, and it helps to read the scores of people you admire and you're going to learn from. Mozart obviously learned from Haydn and vice versa. It seems to me the structure, without the structure, a friend of mine said once that if paintings, this is drifting into the modern world, but he said if modern paintings were buildings, they would fall down. And what he was arguing for was understanding, for instance, there's a chapter in this book about one of the huge options in how to organize a painting is as a series of planes that move back in space, one overlapping another, like a playing card on a table, overlapping another, and that works you back into space. That's incredibly different than taking the cards and making a house of cards where each card is an axis into space that leads you in. Like Rubens, I did a drawing of the Rubens raising of the cross. It's a huge tetrahedron, and the more you look at it, the more you realize he had a spatial idea initially that was metaphoric. It's aggressive, it's violent, and then the neighboring altarpiece is the deposition, and it's all planar, and it's tragically frontal, plane after plane after plane, as opposed to all parallel to each other, as opposed to these wedge shapes, these axial movements that in his eye, I think, must have had a tragic connotation. Well, they both did, but a different kind of, one is very active, one is very static, but they have metaphoric implications.
So, I mean, in a way, part of what you're saying is that, we exaggerate the extent to which there are new things under the sun, right? So, Clement Greenberg famously said, that modern art is all about, right, the discovery of flatness and so forth. But you say that this is something that every painter knows about, right? You can't not know about it if you're a painter, right?
Absolutely. As soon as you look at a piece of canvas, you realize you're painting on a flat surface. And in the Renaissance, there's a brilliant book by John White called Birth and Rebirth of Pictorial Space, which was a Bible for us in graduate school. And he talks about the Renaissance painters being early Renaissance painters being absolutely aware, partly because they were doing murals on walls, that it is a flat surface. And they accommodated and brilliantly, in some ways, hid the clues about perspective. They weren't trying to carve a huge hole in the wall. They were doing anything but. They were constantly grading the movement your eye steps back into space. And I think that Clement Greenberg was a little naive in thinking that somehow or other we had come across this for the first time. And it's analogous to a lot of misconceptions we have about this kind of art that I'm talking about. For instance, it's funny. It's humorous. There are very strangely odd things to be found out there that speak to me. I know there are art historians who say all this art is inaccessible to us because we can only project our own lives onto it. I don't agree with that. I think that if you see a misericord, one of these chairs in a cathedral, and you flip it up and there's somebody blowing air out of his butt, that's funny. And it's also a comment on the authority of the church. It's funny. And also, I talk a fair amount about a Rubens tapestry, painting for a tapestry. And you see this image of a narrative, and then you realize it itself is a tapestry being held up by little putti who are all but grinning at you and smiling and saying, "This is an illusion, dummy." I mean, in other words, they were aware of they were totally aware of what they were doing. And Greenberg sometimes seemed to think that if they had a Nikon camera, we wouldn't have to have had the Renaissance. I mean, that basically that's all they were aspiring to, was photographic realism. That's absolutely, absolutely ridiculous, in my opinion.
Well, I should mention that for those of you who are thinking about buying the book, that inside the book there are reproductions of the works that you discussed, that you made, right? Sort of, you would go to the museums and you would sit there and draw what you saw. But on your website, you have the photographic reproduction. So I highly recommend everybody go there. And I didn't just realize this until after I read the book. But, we do go to museums and we see people in there, artists who are, attempting to reproduce what they see. And I think the preliminary title of this book was Stealing from Museums. And you spent a lot of time talking about your life as a museum goer. And certainly I think the way in which you experience museums is very different from the typical museum goer. You really do spend a lot of time in the museums and you go to great lengths to find the art in situ. So, maybe we can talk a bit about, what is it about seeing work in the flesh on site that is different from looking at reproductions? Because if we do have this Nikon, photograph of a painting, shouldn't that be sufficient if that's what the painters are trying to
do? Well, you had to be there, is I think one of the titles of one of the chapters. It's especially true of sculpture. In other words, it's obvious that you need to rotate around, move all the way around a sculpture to experience it. It's an object in the world, and no matter how many photographs you have, the tactility and the presence of that space-occupying object will never come across in reproductions. So kids, understandably, can't all afford to go off to Italy to see John Bologna's Rape of the Sabine Women in Florence, but being there is expensive and difficult. I get that. But at the same time, I've had so many wonderful experiences. It's getting harder, I admit. It was cheaper, for one thing, when I was younger. And I had a VW van, and I drove around every place I could to see the art. And I had time. It was intimidating because anyway, I'll getting sidetracked from what you asked. There's an homogenization that goes on, unfortunately, in these dark rooms we sit in art history classes. Everything's the same size. So you can have a miniature by Hilliard, and you can have a mural the size of a wall, and they somehow or other become analogous. And to some extent, that's not the end of the world, because the structure, sometimes the structure of a Hilliard English miniature would be perfectly happy being blown up to life size. Or a Rembrandt etching, a tiny little etching, could be a plan for a huge mural because he was thinking that way. Mm. So to some extent, I'm not going to be that hard on it, but getting there is also half the fun. I mean, I loved going to, it's not there anymore, but there was a Piero della Francesca in a graveyard in Italy, and getting there was difficult. There was no GPS. This was quite a while ago. Well, you give her 1,000 lira, 2,000 lira. And she would open the doors of this secluded spot in the woods, and you would see this Piero, the way it was intended to. It's a misericord. It's to reassure the viewers or the people coming to this thing. And it was very reassuring to me, because it wasn't just something on a white wall in a museum. It was something in a context of bucolic woods. I felt like I was a pilgrim the way someone was in 1440 or whenever this thing was put up. It being there is not just being in museums, and for me anyway, is not just being in museums and seeing things, because there's an homogenization once you put things on the wall too. I mean, in some ways we think that every painting was intended to be on a white wall. Well, no, most paintings were intended to be in a context of a house or a palace. So anyway, it one way or another, being there for me is a pleasure. I mentioned in the book that I had a student who I felt sorry for because she was not a very happy creature. But I was talking about Matisse, and she said, this is second year drawing. And she said, are we supposed to know who Matisse is? And I said, well, it's up to you. In my opinion, it's like asking, should you know who Beethoven is? Should you know who Abraham Lincoln is? Should you know anything? The people who own the world, the people who control our lives, would rather you know nothing, because they would rather that you just sort of shut up and be a consumer. And the students sort of thought I was being depressive or something, but I do sort of think that she was missing out on a joy too. It's like saying, do we have to eat this delicious meal with this delicious wine? Matisse is a pleasure. Matisse is all about joy. I mean, it's so, yes, getting there is important, but as aides de memoire, you can do little drawings which imprint these things more on your brain, or you can take a photograph and look at it to evoke the experience. We just got back from London, and I spent 7 days in all the museums I could fit in. And I must admit, I took 1 million pictures, and those will be insufficient, but there on the computer as more aids to memory than in some way a substitution for. There's no substitution for being in front of a painting, really. These were old friends, these huge Tintorettos, huge Veronese, a huge Canaletto, the Parthenon, the Elgin marbles. They have a presence that you can't communicate, I think, ever by images alone.
Now, you're married to a writer, and we all know that writers will talk about their reader, right? So when they're writing, they sort of have an ideal reader in mind, and visual artists presumably also have a viewer or a reader in mind. And part of it's about the situation that they're in, right? They expect to be experiencing this work in a specific place or location, if it's say a mural or a fresco. But what does it mean to think about the reader? I mean, do you imagine somebody coming to the work with a set of pre-existing interpretive schema, or what is that like for a visual artist to imagine when you are creating a work of art, do you imagine that the viewer is someone like yourself, someone who, I've seen your murals at Cabell Hall, and I think most people who see them kind of just walk past them, maybe give them a few seconds of a glance. Others will spend time actually looking at each of the panels. You did your work in St. Louis, right? And it's an allegory that references Homer. What percentage of the people who go to work in the office even know who Homer is, right? And so what is it important that the reader have some pre-existing capacity to understand what you're doing? Or do you just kind of say, well, there is going to be a few people that I'm ultimately going to be able to reach, and that's enough?
I think that's more the latter. And once something's out of your studio or on the wall, it's out of your control anyway. I mean, you engineer's a bad word. You create something that you hope will speak to some people. A lot of the paintings I've done are based on myths, and not no one, but very few people are immersed in myth the way the viewer in the Renaissance would have been. And even then, when we say the Renaissance, we're talking about the educated few. I mean, but on another level, if you think about the peasants who came into the church and saw images of hell, say, that was a pretty powerful message without any text, without any literacy. So on some level, you're hoping that you'll have an audience that responds in different ways. One of my teachers, much beloved, Gabriel Latterman, said he wanted his paintings to be understood by his mother, who did not paint and who didn't really know what he knew, which was phenomenal. but he wanted there to be levels of acceptability, not acceptability, of appreciation or comprehension. And he couldn't control how much the audience knew coming in. He would hope endlessly for a more educated audience, but he knew that basically no one would know what he knew. He knew more than I do. He knew he was brilliant, and it's the same thing for, it seems to me, for poets who write in different ways. Some write for an audience that is immersed in the arcana of structure in poetry, and other people write to be much more accessible. And that's an intention. I don't paint the way I paint to make it, it's what comes out. So we had dinner last night with some Chinese friends who were painters, and we were talking about the differences between pictorial space in the West and the East. And it was interesting, but and I said, yeah, but when you get in front of the canvas, what comes out, comes out. In other words, you can have lots of theories, you can have lots of ideas. There's that wonderful quote where Degas said to his friend Mallarmé, Monsieur Mallarmé, I'm writing poems. I have some good ideas for poems. And Mallarmé said, but Monsieur Degas, poems are made with words, not ideas. And it's analogous to painting. Paintings are made of paint. They're not made of ideas. This, by implication, could refer to the modern art world, but we don't have to go there.
Well, yeah, I mean, you said when you experience painting, look at the painting first, and then, look at the sign if you have to. But I think, there are some artists that kind of flip that around, right, and say, look at the sign first, and then look at the work of art, right?
Well, again, I avoid talking about what's going on in the art world because I tend to get a little upset. But yeah, I think that there are pieces, let's call them, that are illustrations of the text as opposed to the other way around. In other words, rather than clarifying something that might have been mysterious, which can work for labels. Sometimes if you don't know what's going on in a painting, you look at the label and it helps somewhat. But if the cart is before the horse, it seems to me that you're using a different part of your brain. You're not seeing visual music, you're reading a text visually. And it's an illustration for an idea as opposed to an embodied structural idea finding form in sculpture or in painting.
Now, at the beginning of the book, you describe an experience that you had when you were young. I guess it was when you were still an undergraduate at Columbia, where you went to the Frick and you saw Bellini's St. Francis. Now, you were not a religious person at the time, and nor are you now, but still, this had a profound impact on you. I mean, Bellini, I can't imagine that Bellini would have, while painting this, ever thought that it would be viewed by people who weren't Christians, right? Mm-hmm. Because, everyone was a Christian. Everyone he knew and, could imagine ever seeing this would be Christian. And yet it still, right, had a powerful impact on you.
Right.
And so, when Bellini paints this, I mean, is it because he knows that, what's human is human, and you don't need to be a Christian for you to understand, right, what is in that image?
I would go with that interpretation. It seems to me there are people who say we should really think twice about saying we can do art history about art that is inaccessible to us because of its age, because, say, Romanesque art is immersed in a culture of religiosity so deep and so given that we'll never really comprehend it the way they did. But we can comprehend it the way we do. And I'm a humanist, I guess that's an out-of-fashion term, enough to think that somehow or other humans can speak to each other across these huge temporal and spatial gaps. That if I look at, when I went to London and I went in to see the Elgin marbles, it took my breath away how present they were. And Picasso said that too. Greek art is more alive now than it ever was. Mm-hmm. It's alive in the moment, even though it's thousands of years old, because they were humans. Granted, they had different assumptions, lots of different takes on the world. They believed in multiple gods. They were very hard on women. They were constantly at war. Well, we are too. But one way or another, all that doesn't exactly drop away, but through that temporal gap, it seems to me that the stuff, these amazing sculptures, these metopes and friezes, and this amazing work basically speaks to me anyway in the moment. And it did to other people. I could see other people taking this in. And I was doing drawings from one of the friezes, and people kept looking over my shoulder, and I had a feeling that they thought the drawing that I was doing might tell them more about what they were seeing. And I hope that's the case with this book. It seems to have sold in China, and I'm interested to see how Chinese audiences, whether they'll feel that somehow or other they've had access, it's given them some access to Western art that some art history might not have given. In other words, talking about what they're looking at, how it's structured, introducing them to Western space making. Not to sound like a formalist, because I assume they'll also think, who in the world is having their breasts cut off in this painting, and why, which is horrifying. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, a painter, not to sound heartless, but a painter will see that in that choice of location, or that choice of how you're moved through the space, is half the story, is half the what the artist is trying to get across.
Yeah, I think it was Picasso. He said, "There's no past or future in art," right?
Right.
And I think there's another quote that you said, a painting's not dead if you are sort of a participant and not a viewer. What is the distinction between, say, a participant as opposed to a viewer when one encounters a work of art?
Well, viewer sounds a little distancing. In other words, I can view a train wreck and then I can be in a train wreck. Viewing is a distancing implication. I enjoy implicating, or trying to implicate, the viewer, let's have to use that word, there are any number of ways you can do that. You can pull them in. Say you have a tiny etching, say you're Goya and you have a tiny etching of the disasters of war, and you're holding it in your hand, and you're all of a sudden pulled into these horrors that are going on again, even though it was 1803 or 5. It's in the present. It's in your present, and you are participating, implicated. You have to wonder, would I have been capable of this behavior? It's a viewer somehow or other could potentially walk through a space and not have an emotional reaction, but somehow or other a participant will be answerable and also find an enjoyment that a viewer might not, if there is a real difference.
And to be a participant, I mean, is it partially about kind of empathizing with the artist themselves? I mean, thinking about what are the decisions that the artist made, and I mean, when you look at a figure, let's say, of course, you will. I mean, I remember when I was taking art history class, my professor told me to, mimic the posture and the gesture of the folks in the painting, and this would help you to understand the painting better. But do you also then have to say, well, okay, why did the artist make this decision, right? Every single square inch of a painting is a product of a decision, right? And so does attempting to understand those decisions, does that distance you from the work, or does that kind of help you to inhabit and participate in the work?
That's a good question. It made me think of Thoreau, who said, apparently, I was seeing nature more clearly until I learned the Latin names for what I was looking at. He felt that somehow or other he had been distanced. You could conceivably, trying to think of how to answer your question. I don't know if we can edit this. Maybe you could remind me what the gist of your question.
So, the gist was, by thinking carefully about what the artist is doing,
yeah.
does this distance you from the work, or does that actually help you to participate in the work?
In general, I think that personality has been overstressed in how we think about art now. In other words, my wife, for instance, Ann Beattie, the writer, people will say, why don't you write a memoir? Over at dinner, you have these amazing stories. And she has absolutely no interest in writing a memoir because she thinks that she is not that the stories, which are all invented, have their own life or should have their own life. And they shouldn't. In fact, we've lived together for 35 years, been married for 35 years. And I've never seen us experience something that then is translated into a story. I don't know where this stuff comes from, but she's incredibly inventive. And so it seems to me, if we stress biography, if we get very involved in Van Gogh's tragic life, we stop seeing the paintings as what he wanted them to be, which are joyous celebrations. He basically said, I wish I were not crazy. I wish I didn't have this affliction. I would be more productive. I wouldn't be different. I wouldn't be a different painter. You can't say, oh, that brushstroke is because he was insane. It's a waste of time, it seems to me, or it's misleading. It makes things biographical when in fact the work should speak for itself and stories speak for themselves. My paintings, I hope, speak for themselves. Our lives are not that interesting. My wife and I, all we ever do is work. I mean, it's not as if this is referring to a life. If I paint a party scene, I did a sort of a bacchanal around a pool, and people all of a sudden thought we had these huge pool parties. I've never had a pool party in my life. It was an invention. And it was an invention perhaps because we don't have pool parties. Maybe it was a fantasy of how life could be. But so what? I mean, that to me, there are strange biographical anomalies. For instance, Georges de Latour is the guy that painted those incredibly quiet paintings of Christ with his hand in front of a candle, and that they're the most refined, meditative, the opposite of violence. And we know almost nothing about the painter, except that he was arrested 6 times for beating his servants almost to death. I mean, does that inform the paintings? Does it make him a hypocrite? Adam Gopnik wrote an article about Picasso, bad man, bad artist. And that's an equation that I think is ridiculous. I mean, and dangerous, actually, because, Picasso had his faults. Absolutely. Look at the work and don't see it biographically. Oh, this is because Marie-Thérèse was his girlfriend and that's why he painted this way. I mean, look at the work. And does it inform? And if you're a painter, can you steal from it? Or is it an exercise in voyeurism and thinking that somehow or other, this madman Van Gogh, how romantic that he cut his ear off and killed himself, perhaps. It seems to me very separate from the work and from literally doing the work in the studio or at the computer.
Yeah, it is very interesting, right? If we discovered, for instance, that a vaccine was invented by by a Nazi or something, right? Like we wouldn't stop taking the vaccine, right? I mean, right. but when we find out that an artist was a murderer or an awful human being, it somehow taints the art, right?
It can't help but taint it. Caravaggio is a great example. He murdered someone or killed someone in a stupid tennis argument. But the powers that be, he had to get out of town for a while, but he was on his way back when he died, sadly, on a beach. It was like the Woody Allen joke about, my grandfather thinks he lays golden eggs. And what do you do about that? Well, we need the eggs. I mean, we don't treat him. We need the eggs. The buyers of Caravaggio's art, people who appreciated and knew how great he was, needed the art. And okay, so you killed somebody. Well, you've been out of town for 8 years. Come on back. We need the eggs. It's interesting, but I'm not sure that, for instance, if we didn't know that Beethoven had gone deaf relatively young and thought about killing himself, would that change the music? It makes it bizarre that he was capable of doing what he did, but it doesn't, to me, change the music itself. It's biographical.
Well, I think you quoted Matisse. He said artists should have their tongues cut out, and so
He talked a lot for someone who thought that.
right. And so, I'm interviewing you, and you're an artist, but it does seem like artists are not the best people when it comes to explaining art, particularly their own art, right? I mean, but we are always asking them to explain their art, whether they're writers or painters.
Yeah.
And I remember that one time, I think it was, I remember, I saw Spike Lee's movie, Do the Right Thing. It was in 1989, I think. And I thought, oh, this is a brilliant movie. This is a classic, and when he was interviewed and he described the movie, he just had a very kind of banal description of the movie. And I thought, he should not be allowed to talk about his own work, right? Because he undersells it.
Right.
So, why, first of all, I mean, why do we continue to ask artists to talk about their work? And why is it that they're often not the people best suited to discuss their work?
Well, there's a painter named Balthus who was very important to us in graduate school, people who are trying to paint figuratively, because he was painting figuratively all the way through modernist French experimentation. Picasso appreciated his work, bought his work. And he was he was asked, he was having a show somewhere, and they sent a telegram saying, could you please explicate your work? And he wrote back and said, Balthus is a painter about whom nothing is known. Now let us look at the paintings. And I thought that was tremendous. That's wonderful. He's right. The paintings speak for themselves. Later, he started talking and giving interviews, and I wished he'd shut up and stuck to his guns because he sounded ridiculous. He sounded sort of pompous and self-important, and he wasn't really talking about the paintings. He was talking about himself and sort of narcissistically digressing about his own biography. The paintings speak for themselves and should. Mm-hmm. And as to whether artists are capable or interested in talking about their work, you can't shut painters up, apparently. My wife thinks. The painters that I know, she says, you guys just talk in ways that writers never talk. And we spent time in Key West, and there were a lot of heavy-hitting writers, Annie Dillard, Bob Stone, any number of well-known writers, and they never talked about each other's work or their own at parties, ever. They were there and supportive of each other because they knew what they were up against and that they'd spent all day, sweating over the typewriter or whatever. But at a party, no, they would never talk. Whereas if I see a painter friend, again, you can't shut us up. There's a story in the book about my friend David Carboni and I went to Cleveland, I guess it was, to see a show of Lenin Brothers. And after talking and standing in front of a painting, I don't know, for 40 minutes, a guard came over, a very sweet woman said, can I ask you gentlemen who you are? And we said, well, we're painters. He said, I thought so. I've never seen anybody look at a painting for so long and talk about it so much. So there are verbal, maybe it's because you're standing in front of a canvas all day, unless you have a model, you're alone. It's a very solitary act. And maybe when you see another painter who speaks the same language, you're off and running, and it's a joy to do that. But that may not be true of other painters. And for all I know, it's only my friends that I talk to.
Now, in the book, you talk a bit about your parents and your childhood, and your father was not someone who was a big supporter of the arts. Didn't really see the relevance of the arts, and so for people who are not raised in a household where they are exposed to the arts, how do they come to discover the arts?
That's a very good question. I think I have a friend his parents are both painters, and he's out of the box, wonderful painter. He's very young, but boy, he's off like a comet. That helps. The genetic, and also his whole life was surrounded by his parents painting in the living room. I mean, the whole house was a studio. That's one thing. I think in a funny way, the fact that my father was so contemptuous of the arts might have helped in rebelling against that. And so and also having my grandmother was a painter apparently, or one of my grandmothers, and that may have been genetically in there somewhere. But for some reason, when I was a little kid, not all I ever did, but I drew things constantly. And so it became more and more rewarding to pursue that, and partly in rebellion, but and also my brother's a scientist, so he had garnered my father's approval for being a physicist. So I wasn't going to compete in that field, and I had no gift for it. So painting, after all this drawing, came naturally.
Mm-hmm. Well, you talk about how artists go to museums like bees go to the beehive, right? They go in hungry, ravenous, and start consuming stuff. But I mean, there's also, the way in which artists approach the world, right? So part of it is approaching other art, but doesn't your interaction with art affect the way you interact with, say, nature and, what you see? I remember, I took a couple painting classes when I was in school, and the instructors there, this was Neil Welliver, and his disciples were sort of in charge of the program there. And I think the biggest impact that they had on me was that I couldn't look at a tree the same way, or I couldn't look at a building the same way, or I couldn't look at, a torso the same way after, doing some painting. And so, do you go into museums like be into the beehive, or do you kind of go into the world, right? Like,
well, they bleed into each other. When the Barnes collection used to be in Marion, out in the countryside, out in the suburbs, one time I was there all day, and there are at least 40 Cézannes there, and I looked at those enjoyably. And I came out, and there were trees. It's now in the center of the city, but back then there were these huge trees. And for about 10 minutes, I was looking through Cézanne's eyes. I could see those trees as Cézanne's. It only lasted 10 minutes, and I wish it had lasted longer, but I had become so immersed in his viewpoint. It does bleed over. I went to Bryce Canyon in Utah, and it was one of the best art experiences I've ever had. Because of the sedimentary rock, things melted away at different levels. There are heads, torsos, lower bodies, hundreds of them. And you're at a distance, so it looks as if you're looking at crowds of people, or even individual groups of people. And so you begin to see that does carry over. And I talk in the book about seeing a forcola in the Venetian oarlock that's on the gondola, under construction in a workshop. And it was as beautiful as any sculpture I'd ever seen. Things aren't just in museums. It does become a joy elsewhere. It expands.
But when you do go into a museum, I think a lot of people don't quite know how to enjoy museums, right? Me personally, I get very intimidated if I go to a place like the Louvre or the Met. I like the Frick, I like the Barnes, I like these places that they're a little bit more manageable. So when you go into these museums, how do you decide what it is that you're going to enjoy? What are you going to learn from? Do you go in with a specific agenda, a specific mission? Do you say, okay, I'm going to go in and into the Prado, and I'm going to go find the Goyas, and I'm going to go check them out? Or do you kind of go in there and have some serendipitous encounters?
I think more the latter. What I usually do is go in and look at the entire collection and then see what I want to spend more time with. The National Gallery in London, where we just visited, it used to be like the Frick. It used to be very condensed, and then downstairs were what they considered the also rans, and now they're all mixed together. And my wife, the first time we went 20 years ago, had that experience of everything was great. Everything was the best of the best of the best, and it was very condensed. She was more taken aback now They had, I think, in my memory, one Canaletto, which is a brilliant stonemason's yard, gorgeous, gorgeous painting. And back in the day, that was the only Canaletto. Now there are everything they have. So say 7 or 8 Canalettos. And she thought, well, they're all the same. She doesn't necessarily look at them the way I do. I was happy as a clam. I could look at Canalettos all day. But it's obviously a different taste. Sculpture I only started really looking at sculpture when I started doing sculpture. Mm-hmm. And I only started looking at sculpture in the round, which is very different than relief sculpture, when I started doing sculpture in the round, because it necessitates, as I said, moving around, circulating, getting all the views and letting them cohere in your mind. That was unknown to me before I started doing it myself and realized the problems involved. And they're very real problems. That's part of what makes it interesting to me, is that they're so difficult to do.
Well, look, if someone like you isn't really noticing sculpture until you start sculpting, and you're a painter, this means that the typical citizen isn't really noticing anything. I mean, what does it mean to be an educated citizen? I mean, you quote John Hollander and this notion that there is such a thing as sort of an educated citizen with some exposure to the humanities. I mean, what do you think? And if someone wants to be sort of an educated citizen, what kind of grounding do they need in the arts? I mean, should they simply be exposed to art be trained to encounter it in a particular way, or should they also dabble in the production of art in order to better understand it?
Well, the quote from John was to that effect, that back in the 1800s, everyone would do a few watercolors, everyone would play a little bit on the piano, everyone would write letters to each other in verse. So when they saw something that was tremendously above their own level, they would appreciate it more than we could. Now, he said, we're intimidated. As soon as we see something that looks like a poem, mm-hmm. we think we're unqualified to deal with it. When I was in London, I made a point of seeing a World War I monument that a very obscure artist named Charles Sargent Jagger, no relation to Mick, did. And to me, it was both an art experience and a historical experience, because I was studying to be an historian when I was in Columbia. And World War I could almost not read about it because it was so ghastly and depressing. This monument was the most moving thing I'd seen as a monument to anything. And it was actually very simple. There were 4 bronze 9-foot-high soldiers around a base of a 1/3 scale howitzer. This is a memorial for the 50,000 people killed in the artillery, which is what's going on in Ukraine now. It's a very dangerous place to be. And this memorial I found moving. I felt the way someone who knew something about World War I would feel. In other words, I didn't start formally analyzing his sculpture as sculpture. I took it in as an experience of tragedy and of loss. Very emotional experience. And I felt this is ideally, that is his ideal audience. And apparently it was very popular with the men who had served in the artillery in World War I, because it spoke to them. It isn't all gesturing and dramatic mm-hmm. swords in the air. It's men standing quietly with their legs spread, and then a dead soldier at eye level, which was very controversial at the time. And I thought, only secondarily am I seeing as a sculptor how he managed to do this. And it seems to me that's maybe more the way someone coming upon that monument, especially if their grandfather died in the First World War, might, if they know something about the war and something about its horrors, this magnificent sculpture in Hyde Park could speak to them. So they do need some preparation. They need to know. I mean, I know young people who don't know that there was a Vietnam War. They think it was like the Trojan War. It's, that was my whole life experience. Go, thank God. But so on some level, it helps to know that there was this horrible war in the trenches for 4 years where millions of people died. It makes it much more moving, although it's still a powerful monument. It does behoove us, I think, to know our own history, to know something, to know things that make life richer. So I don't know how to do that. I'm not sure schools are they're doing away with humanities departments. It's all STEM, and that's a loss, it seems to be, because you're not even going to know what World War I was if you don't have some reading of history. And that's tragic. And also, selfishly speaking, it means probably whatever I do is less accessible. The more it's dependent on some immersion in the traditions of art, Western art especially, and in history and in myth. But I can't control that. I can't, I can write a book and hope that a few people read it, but I can't educate a generation of people to see the way I see, nor should they necessarily.
Well, do you think people are intimidated? I mean, people don't say, I'm not going to learn math because I'm never going to be, Einstein. But people might say, I'm not going to learn drawing because I'm never going to be any good at it. I mean, do you think people are intimidated because they're continuously exposed to, works of great art, just sort of, it's available, it's out there, you know about it. I mean, is there a level of intimidation that deters people?
Well, again, I sort of vowed not to talk about the current art world, but I think there's a tremendous amount of intimidation, or until recently, there was a tremendous amount of intimidation there, and tremendous level of ambition on the artist's part. A guy named Barnett Newman said his paintings were going to end capitalism. And okay, I wish they had, but they didn't. And there's the grandiosity that's met. In other words, the more difficult it is to, the more opaque. There's a writer who wrote a book called "Why Are Our Paintings Puzzles?" Mm-hmm. And the gist of it is, why are we making these things as if they're codes that are so difficult to read? He also wrote a book called Paintings and Tears that talk about that book, the painting, the Bellini that we were talking about earlier. And he wrote to art historians and said, when I, the author, was young, I cried in front of that painting. And now I don't, because I became educated like the Thoreau with learning the Latin names. I study it, I appreciate it, I analyze it, I talk about it, I teach it, but I don't cry in front of it. And intimidation and crying are the flip side of each other. In other words, you're never going to cry if you're feeling intimidated by something. It seems to me it's worth thinking about the reader or the viewer or the participant as to not making something into a quiz, not making something into a rebus puzzle. That might interest some people. I mean, we have friends who do puzzles out of the New York Times. We don't.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like the way that art history is taught. I mean, it once was taught by just a series of slides with dates and names, and now I think it sometimes is taught with more of a critical agenda. But I mean, how should it be taught? I mean, how what kind of seeing skills should be practiced? I mean, can one actually aspire to see like an artist if one is not an artist?
Well, that's interesting. I have friends who taught on a Fulbright in Brussels, or in Belgium. I'm sorry. I have friends who taught in Belgium on a Fulbright, and first, having taught here in the States, they were contemptuous of the fact that the teachers there gave their students an overview of American literature. It was like a conceptual temporal map of where things fit in. And they thought, well, that's not the way we do it in the States. We specialize almost immediately and start talking about very specific, we'll get to the whole by getting through these small portals. And after a while, they realized actually it helps tremendously to have this overview, to have this big picture. And I think the same is true of art, that if you know roughly when the early Renaissance was and what paintings from that period tend to look like, as opposed to, say, Impressionist paintings, they're not, they're very different. And there's a beauty to be found. And it's not about categorizing or passing a test and saying, aha, I see that's from 1450. It's about it does help to have a big picture of where things fit in. So it's not to use a puzzle imagery, but it helps to know when Géricault lived during right after the French Revolution and Napoleon. It helps to know, it helps to know these things. But it seems to me the way I did it was to gradually put this picture together by driving around with a Fred Hart's book on Renaissance and looking at everything I could look at and trying to match it up with having this temporal map. And it worked. I mean, I know when I can look at a painting, I can go to it. It amuses my wife. I can go to a museum and say, Angelico, give the date. It's not a showing off. It's that these are old friends who you know so well. I don't know, because I've done this, I don't know what it's like to not have that, that at your back. I don't know what it feels like. All I can say is, for instance, having listened to the radio and listened to classical music all my life, I know roughly when something was written, even if I don't know who it was by. But I don't read the biographies of Bach, who I admire tremendously. I don't speak German, so I don't know what the cantata, what they're singing. So that's a huge loss on my part. It's analogous to somebody going to a museum and not really knowing that that's Apollo and Daphne. But they're seeing this sculpture, as it turns out, by Bernini, where life-size figures, a male is chasing a woman who's turning into a laurel tree, and her fingers in marble are becoming leaves. And you look at it, and whether you know the Apollo and Daphne story or not, it's most people, whether they know anything about art or not, are going to be mind blown that anybody could do this. It's just, and actually Michelangelo would have hated it, because he said a good sculpture ought to be able to you ought to be able to roll a good sculpture down a hill and it will maintain its integrity. Well, the Bernini would be thousands of chunks and shards. It would be nothing. And he would have thought that meant it wasn't true sculpture. These people all had very strong opinions.
Well, I mean, some people talk about the anxiety of influence, and I think in your book you said that we shouldn't experience anxiety of influence. We should experience joy of influence. So, I mean, you spent a lot of time looking at your predecessors, and so how come when you spend time studying your predecessors, this serves as fertilizer for your work rather than asphyxiating your creativity? Yeah. I mean, and is that what, I mean, is that normal for artists, or is the kind of anxiety of influence more normal?
I can't speak for other artists, but I think there were creepy paintings done, I can't remember where, but in a museum, and I can't remember where the painters were obviously trying to learn from Veronese. But it was men in tights. They had the same costumes and the same level, an imitative level of skill, but they just didn't work. They were not learning from the structure of the Veronese or from the joy of the Veronese. They were kind of dutiful borrowings of technique. And for me, technique is not a terribly positive word. It smacks of, stand oil and pigment and carving tools and things that are necessary, but not the essence. When I talk about structure, I'm thinking about, for instance, in one of the essays, there are two kinds of sculpture. Rodin's sculpture, which is almost like Rubens' axial freedom, and then this German who basically endorsed planar thinking in sculpture. So you started with a block and you worked back from the face and you were contained on Hildebrand, and they hated each other's work for good reason. And actually, Rodin, I find much more interesting. But that kind of thinking leads to structural innovation, I think, rather than imitative borrowing or copying. And it's certainly not appropriation, which came to mean making fun of this earlier art as if we're somehow superior to it. So it's as if you're trashing something magnificent because of either your anxiety over the influence or your feeling of superiority, both of which are tedious. So what I'm advocating for in this book is looking beneath the surface of even touch. I don't talk about facture, but try to stress how you read art, how a sculpture carries your eye around, how a painting guides your eye through into depth and then back out again. Things like that, which are timeless, it seems to me. They can be applied now just as well as they were applied in the Elgin marbles or Fra Angelico, or Pontormo, who's a major favorite of mine.
Now, do you ever think that, for instance, the murals that you've done will at some point...
Pontormo looks modern to me because he's... Sorry.
Go ahead, start all over.
Oh, I see a sign saying your internet connection is unstable. So I stopped.
That's fine. You just start all over with Pontormo.
Yeah. Well, a hero of mine is Pontormo, who painted productively in the 1530s. And he looks modern to my eyes. Modern meaning he's very aware of the picture plane. He's simplifying forms dramatically. You can use that. You can steal from that. You can apply that as a way of thinking and not have it be Christ being deposed from the cross, or not have it be Mary Magdalene, which is what he was doing. You can apply it to the things that obsess you, that interest you. So right now I'm conceiving of paintings based in Ukraine because I'm sort of obsessed with what's going on there. But I can use their language, but not their literal imagery, or the look of the Veronese is not what I'm interested in. It's the spatial thinking that's so clear on his part, so beautiful.
Now, when you look at the murals that you've done, do you ever imagine what'll happen when those murals get removed from their current locations and maybe?
I know what will happen. They'll be destroyed. But they won't survive. They're glued to the wall on campus, and if they tried to take them off, they would be in the garbage heap. So I'm hoping they stay there. I certainly hope they're considered a contribution to Mr. Jefferson's legacy. I know there are problems with Mr. Jefferson. The problem with everything these days, but I'm hoping. A student came by when I was working on the murals in Kabul and said, she was Asian, and she said, "How long will these be here?" And I said, 800 years. Because I was thinking, well, Giottos are 800 years old. Let's hope that we're in the same company. I don't know how long they'll last. I don't know how long anything will last. I don't know how long. I've had murals taken down, and they haven't survived really. It's a very strange culture. In Europe, it's illegal to destroy artwork, which creates its own problems. There are warehouses full of stuff that calls itself art. But I sort of wish on some level there were something here and that was analogous, so that you couldn't just cut down trees and destroy art at whim. Those are two of my favorite things, art and trees.
Well, Lincoln, thanks so much for joining me. Your book is called Seeing Like an Artist. Check it out. There's also some other writing in some journals, and also check out the work, check out the art. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
This is unSILOed, brought to you by Alumni FM, connecting people through stories.